All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in and joining this TechStrong learning experience where I'm joined with Brinka. I do have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. This session is being recorded. It will be available on demand afterward, and we will send you a link to the recording once we conclude. On the right side of your screen, you'll see that we do have a chat, a Q&A, a survey. Be sure to share your experiences, your comments, your understanding on today's topic at any point, and at the bare minimum, tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat. Use the Q&A for questions at any time. No question is too big or too small. Make sure you pop them in there. During our Q&A portion, we want to make sure that we can get to those. And any questions that we're not able to get to, we want to make sure we can reach out to you after we conclude. We've also got that survey. It's 3 quick, easy questions. Make sure to give us your feedback at any time throughout today's portion. And with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's topic. We've got data is the differentiator for exposure management. And today I'm joined with Mike Bizarre. He's our Chief Content Officer here at TechStrong. Mike, I'm going to go ahead and thank you for joining us and turn it over to you and let you take it away from here.
All right, sounds good, but welcome everybody. And yeah, we're going to have a little chat about vulnerabilities and, well, how to manage them because they've been with us forever. The challenge is that, well, they're not all created equal. When you think about it, some of them may not even be relevant. A lot of organizations spend a lot of time tracing down which ones matter the most and which one might be the most lethal to their business. And that creates a significant challenge because you need tools and expertise to do that. Fernando Montenegro is with us from Futurum, and he's kind of the expert in that space for security for us. So I'm going to let him dive into more of the details behind that. But I also want to welcome James Walter from Brinka. He's one of their experts as well. And the two of them are going to walk us through, well, A, how do you manage this process? And B, how do you do it, well, successfully? Fernando, let me hand it off to you and kind of frame the conversation, if you would, for us, because I think a lot of folks get the idea, but maybe there are some newbies here and everybody has a slightly different place where they start.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. I just want to put the slide with the picture, and I apologize for the false advertising. My picture is a little bit older than I am right now. But I wanted to introduce myself and introduce James as well. So let James introduce himself. So I'm Fernando Montenegro. I lead cybersecurity research here at Futurum. I've been the white hair means that I've been around the block for a while, right? Which fits perfectly with the theme for what we're going to talk about today, because we're going to talk about where we are, where we were, where we are, and where we're going in relation to vulnerability management and exposure management. I should mention that as an industry analyst, I cover this space, and there are several trends that I'll mention throughout the presentation. But it's really interesting to see how the space is evolving on multiple fronts, and it's a true pleasure to be joined by James here. So I'll pass it over to James if you want to say a few words as an introduction.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Fernando. So, from my side, James Walta, I currently run product for Brinka. Been with Brinka for 10 years or so, and really from my perspective have, played a bunch of different roles, working with a lot of different styles of engagements with prospects and customers over the years. Early on, working with more on the pre-sale side, looking at customers and what they were searching for, what problems they were trying to address. Led our customer success organization for a while as well. So dealt with more of our long-term customer relationships and more of, what comes with maturity, how they're, shaping up their organizations and what their roadmaps are starting to look like. And now kind of tying all of those worlds together in the product side, aligning that with our strategic roadmap as well. And I think the topic that we have for today is, as you said, is obviously a very exciting one. Over my 10 years or so within the industry, it's certainly the most tumultuous time. A lot of excitement around how things are changing and how things are adapting. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping in.
Perfect. So we alluded to the topic briefly. So I'll just pop up briefly what the agenda is. We're getting past the introductions. The comment I'll make is that we work together with Brinka, putting together a short market brief on a few key trends, and and this conversation actually emanated in part from that paper. So if that's not available right now, it will be available soon for download. And by all means, stay in touch and reach out to Brinka and us, and we can get you guided there. Where we wanted to talk about is, so this is how we framed the conversation, where we've been, right, where we are now, right, and I don't know, 5 minutes into the presentation, give or take, somebody brings up AI. So yes, we'll bring up AI, right? Of course, it's a huge factor, right, and where we're going, right. So I think that those are some of the key areas that we want to touch, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. Without further ado, what I wanted to frame the conversation for us is where we've been, right? I think that the expression that people have referred to is whack-a-mole in the context of vulnerabilities. And the very term vulnerability has evolved over time, right? I think that Mike brought it up really well in the beginning here. He brought up that, hey, not all are created equal. And that has been a perennial problem for vulnerabilities. And then what how did we get here? Like, I mean, what got us here? And I think that from my perspective, there's two elements that we need to keep in mind. One is that it's difficult to analyze a system individually, right? There's two sides to computer security or cybersecurity. There's one where you analyze a component individually, right? Look, this particular component behaves this way, has these vulnerabilities, right? We've done whatever sort of analysis, and we found these vulnerabilities, and these need to be addressed. The problem is that those vulnerabilities, A, they don't exist in isolation, right? And B, they exist in relation to the rest of your environment. And what I mean here is that for good and for bad, right, a vulnerability that may be a relatively low issue in isolation becomes a significant problem down the line, because it's used perhaps not as the final thing that gets an adversary to compromise to achieve their objectives, but it's a stepping stone or it's a distraction. So a low may not be a low, right? At the same time, a high or a critical may not be a high or a critical, because in the context that against a particular type of adversary, there is enough around the system that is vulnerable, that the vulnerability, yes, it's there, but it's not necessarily something that's going to be exposed to that adversary under most conditions. We can bring this down. So I think that is one of the key problems that we have. And here at Futurum, we do tons of conversations and surveys with end users, and those kinds of concerns around how do we manage the deluge of vulnerabilities keep popping up time and time again. I think it'll be in the paper, but we've published some stats where the lack of expertise, the lack of availability in terms of resources to fix things has been a perennial problem. But I don't want to talk too much on this just myself. James, let me bring it over to you. Like you've seen, we've seen this from our vantage point of data popping up. I'd love to hear what's been happening from your side. How do you see the how we got here from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I think over the years, right, it's been more or less the same problem, just growing in terms of volume, right? But it's been more linear, and I think kind of the pivot point, which we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation, is that growth in a volume of what we're processing is now hitting that exponential curve. Right. So it's still very similar in terms of shape and in terms of the challenges that we're facing, but it's growing at a rate that I don't think anyone really saw coming prior to the last couple of years. In terms of where we've been and hitting on some of the topics we have outlined here, I think vulnerability management as a whole has traditionally been more of that whack-a-mole process, and just understanding whatever has the loudest noise, whatever draws the most context is really what people target quickly. And at some scale that works, right? But it only works up to a certain point. And I think the real challenge that I've seen, and I think we've heard echoed from what you've done research into, and then directly from many of our customers as well, is the teams that are going out to address these problems. They're not growing at the same rate of the risk and the vulnerabilities. So it's the same size teams expected to do 10 times more, and soon to be 100 or 1,000 times more. And so that's really shining a light on all of the challenges where it's no longer enough just to create a bunch of noise. There's a lot of decision making that has to go into that process. And we can dig in deeper on some of the future topics on where that really lies. But that I think frames kind of the where we've been. It's been more just dealing with the problem, addressing noise, and now things are exponentially noisier. So we need a more diligent process to deal with that.
Yeah, it's funny or it's notable that you bring up hey, we have to, the same team now has to do X more, right? When as analysts, like one of the things that we like to do is call out trends, right? So the four major trends that I talk about, and then the fifth major one. The first one, of course, is AI. All things AI. How we can get into AI in a little bit, right? The second trend is precisely this. It's what we call the expansion of the attack surface, right? And I say that it's the expansion and the compression. It's the expansion of the attack surface on two dimensions. Dimension number one is exactly as you said. We're now having to deal with more things, right? Dimension number two is that not only are we dealing with more things, but we're dealing sometimes with different things, right? Many years ago, I made one could make a rather successful career out of managing endpoint alerts only, right? Nowadays, in order to adjudicate any particular suspicious incident, you need to figure in endpoint telemetry. You need to figure in network telemetry. You need to figure in other things. And that makes it more complex. And at the same time, there's been this compression, right? I mean, on one hand, and we'll talk about that in a second, but in one hand, we've seen dwell times start to come down a little bit, right? Or come down significantly in some cases, while at the same time, the perimeter is gone. Like I'm old school. I've been around for a very long time. I remember the discussions around the deperimeterization, right? What we call now zero trust, right? And it's impressive to see how the same incident or the same fleet that you had to manage much more is now much more spread, which means that sometimes it may be exposed to other things. So the question becomes that it becomes a significant problem. Now, one of the things that when you and I were talking is that there is a difference in scale, right? When you are doing this within a smaller organization versus when you're doing within a larger organization. And one of the things that I'm curious is, like, from our perspective, we've always seen the challenge that within an organization, you end up with different silos of information, right? And then the job, the onus is on you as a security team to put those silos together. Maybe your company made an acquisition and someone is using a different tech security stack than you, whether that be for the telemetry, whether that be enforcement or analytics. This complexity of enterprise environments is something that we see popping up all the time. I'm wondering, I assume you've seen something similar.
Yeah, very much so. I think, it really comes down to the process, right? And even in a small scale environment, like it's, the metric everyone likes to point to is MTTR. How quickly can we get something done, right?
Yep.
And on a small scale organization, or when you have very simple data that you're dealing with, it really is just address the noise, right? The loudest thing that comes up, go knock it down as fast as you can. As you start to get a little bit more complex, you get a bigger environment, maybe you have multiple tools deployed, then context starts to matter, right? and that leads to better decision making, which I think is kind of the secondary theme throughout the topic here today, is that the data you have, the context you have, helps you make better decisions and how to use that. But you also have to communicate that effectively, right? As you said, you have multiple teams throughout that process. You have the security team where their focus is detecting and identifying, vulnerabilities, or soon to be more around the exposure side. But then that gets handed over to someone who actually has to go and remediate. And if they're revalidating decisions, if they have to go against their silo of information to figure out what's top priority, where do I address fixes first, and they're not reinventing the wheel, but they're kind of going through that decision process all over again, that just slows the whole train down. And again, so that works up to another scale, but then you kind of cross the tipping point when you're in a larger, more complex environment, and especially nowadays with noise, lack of a better phrase to call it, but more data, more vulnerabilities being detected. There's just even that much more to deal with. So you need more efficiency, you need better communication to help justify the decisions that are already being made, and kind of translate that down the track to help get faster remediation and ultimately just drive better protection.
100%. And then we came, and which brings us to, so we talked a little bit about how we got here, right? Where are we now? And the joke I'll make is now with AI. So, I'm sorry, right? But we are, the scenario that we find ourselves in is that you have this explosion, Cambrian explosion of the perimeter, or of what your environment is. You have the silos as you described. Factoring into this, we have AI both as a helper, but both as help and as hindrance, right? We have this notion of how do you actually differentiate? It's what I alluded to before. How do you differentiate between a vulnerability in the context of, is it truly exploitable, right? And we have seen this shift to exposure management more, right? And then this one pokes at me a little bit, because I used to do a lot of endpoint security, and when we talk to people, a lot of people say, "Oh, absolutely, you need to go ahead and do a full inventory before you can do anything." And the challenge that I always push back is that, look, you can. There used to be an old tweet hanging around about how many endpoints do we have, and depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers, right? But more than that, it's the fact that an inventory is never done, right? I think that we say in the slide here in the context of data classification, but what I mean is you have to have processes that account for that drift, that account for that constant variability. Like we are, and I like to bring in the world of anti-fraud. I used to work in anti-fraud for a few years. In anti-fraud, there is the concept of shrinkage, right? There is always a little bit of inventory that's going to magically disappear, and it just is. If you come and you tell as an anti-fraud team, and you say, "Oh no, we're going to bring shrinkage to zero," the business leaders are going to say no, because that is too expensive to fix, right? In the context of what we see now is this notion that you have to have fully inventoried systems or fully inventoried data before you can do anything. You're going to be waiting around forever, right? So one of the things that and now with AI, right? One of the things that that we're seeing is people being concerned about, okay, how do I navigate this world where I have the noise that you described, but also the extra AI noise in the conversations that you've been having with people, right? What's been working, right, in terms of how do you get people to rethink what they are actually exposed to?
Yeah. Well, and then I'll echo kind of what you started with, which is there's this notion of perfect data helps solve the problem, but no one's ever going to get there, right? And the biggest thing that we hear in conversations with our customers and just other enterprises that are out there is, especially in those complex environments, it's not even achievable to hope to get 90% of the way there, right? They got to be happy with what they've got. And it really pivots the conversation to more around acting on the information that you can trust, make that a priority first, and then figure out how to get more efficient with that. Build upon that process. But you really have to establish a process. That's what you need to focus on more than the context of the data itself. And I think with as we phrased here, surviving the AI deluge of volumes of information. It just hones in on that need that much more, right? So in a world where we're pivoting from traditional vulnerability management, where it's address the loudest vulnerability, address the highest CVSS score, and moving into more exposure management, it's more intelligent decision making that really is the difference between those two scenarios, right? And that decision making ability comes from trusted data applied with diligent process. And so having a process in place, make sure that everyone's on the same playing field of what we're expected to do. And then using the information that we have, not perfect data, but if we know that certain network segments are more mission critical, or we have our crown jewels following a certain naming convention, those are things that we can use as additional indicators to leverage that context to start to address more of the actual management of risk mitigation. And so I think that's more or less the maturity shift, right? Is because the volume is so out of control now, it's much more dependent on leveraging the context you have and getting into more of an exposure management mindset.
It's interesting how all these things come together, right? One of the word context, like if somebody does a word search on stuff that I write about and whatnot, the word context comes up an inordinate amount of times, right? Precisely because that is what is needed now. Like, so on one hand, particularly for more complex organizations, you need to evolve to an environment where there is a significant amount of telemetry, which is useful, of course, don't get me wrong, but okay, vulnerability in server cube1.austin.prod.company.com, right? What, right? And I find interesting that we are, and if you ask me, I think that one of the things that we have to thank for cloud environments is that cloud environments gave us an inkling of what a more normalized telemetry can look like. And now we want to bring that to other environments as well, right? And when you factor in the business content, and what I caution people or what I push people a little bit is, what is the business context for what you're doing, right? Not just the technical context. Oh, yes, I can get getting domain admin is bad. We all agree on that, right? Great, but are you getting domain admin on walled off system in a lab versus are you getting domain admin on on a production domain controller at headquarters, right? There's a difference there. And are you the same thing with vulnerabilities on data exposure? Hey, look, somebody accesses this, they can access the internal info. They can't break in, but they can get unauthorized access to data. Is unauthorized access to data I like to say our kitchen cafeteria server, or is it our financial system the day before we announce public earnings, right? There's a difference here, right? And bringing that kind of context is critical. I do want to ask you, what have you seen in the context of AI? Because one of the conversations that we've been having is people saying, "Oh yeah, I can use AI to do this," and my fear is that people have been treating AI as a little bit too much of a black box. Oh yeah, the AI is going to do this for me, and I'm done. Uh, have that come up in your chats?
Yeah, it has a lot, right? I think the research that's out there has maybe not overhyped the reality, but it's certainly put a lot of excitement around it, and I think a lot of researchers are making some assumptions on how AI gets used or how it gets leveraged, and then on the corporate side, there's a lot of hope too, right? I mean, these are challenges that people have been facing for their whole careers, and now there's potentially this black box fix of I don't know how it works, but it fixes the problem maybe. And so it creates a lot of anticipation, a lot of expectations. And I think really where AI works well in a current state, and I know we'll talk a little bit about where we're going and maybe lean in a little bit deeper into this conversation. But where it works well is AI today is really an accelerator for the processes that you already have. Right. If you have good decision making, if you have good policies in place, and you know where you're going, and it's well documented or well outlined, AI can certainly help you accelerate along that path. But it's certainly not a replacement for any of those steps. And so I think avoiding the black box scenario of where you just hope it does things for you, and having more transparency in that process and trust on how it's applied is really the key differentiator. Even from our perspective, the way that we've more or less incorporated AI into some of our initial releases over the last 6 or 12 months has really been a heavy focus on transparency and trust.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want anything to be black box. We want to essentially use AI to help accelerate the processes that our customers have already built out within our solution, and maybe take it a step further than what's possible scale wise, right? We can throw more context, so to speak, at AI, and it will help give us the desired outputs. But we have inputs. We have the ability to look at and decide what confidence level do I need before I can really jump in and take advantage of that particular process that AI is helping accelerate. And then on the output side, it's much more about transparency. Again, it's still the same people involved in that process. So as it moves from person A on detection to the next person in line for prioritization, and then getting assigned out for remediation, that transparency is key. It can't just be a number or that it's top of the table because AI did something. It needs to be included with the data points and the evidence and the transparency around how those decisions were made, so that way we all still stay on the same page and trust that process.
I love how you frame that, and people usually latch on to a single number and they think, oh yeah, this is the number that I need to go to. No, there's a lot more than that. I think that this industry is maturing, is evolving, and I honestly think that part of where we are going is we have to become more predictable and more, I want to say, engineering driven, almost like. And so with that kind of thought in mind, right, where are we going, right? And one of the things that I saw that I keep seeing in conversations, and we are seeing this maturing of the industry practices by end user organizations. One of the things that I'm paying particularly close attention to is this evolution of governance, right? We have been moving towards better risk management overall. People refer to cyber risk quantification as a key discipline, and we're seeing significant progress there. And I find that this is the area where security executives are improving quickly in terms of how they are going to take what they already know and then work with their stakeholders, board of directors, other senior executives, etc., about meaningful outcomes for their businesses, right? Something that's actually aligned to priorities. And I'll revert us back to the comment I made at the beginning about the scope of things, right? I think that one of the fins that we have in this industry is that too many of our conversations, they are very fatalistic, not fatalistic, but they're very binary. Are you compromised? If you are, a compromise is bad. Yes, I agree, right?
Yeah.
But compromise is bad in context, right? So as an organization, you should assume, you should build the program, you should base your decisions on the scenario that, yes, in some cases we may have a breach in a particular area of the network or of our systems. How do we contain that? And so that kind of acceleration, as you brought up, that bringing down the MTTR is so critical. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, so where do you, when you talk to people about being more forward looking, like what are you telling them? What are they asking for? How is this coming together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things to highlight there. I think, first and foremost, when you look at where we're going and how to leverage AI or some of the capabilities that we can expect there, I'd say the one thing that I would hammer home with everybody is that there is no replacement for accountability. So you are still responsible for the decisions that are being made. If AI is a part of that decision, great, but use it responsibly. And I think the way that you have it outlined here in the first bullet point is predictive context. That's really kind of the next step, right?
Mm-hmm.
If current state is use context to help make better decisions, then the next step forward is let's have more predictive context. And where AI is really great is looking at trends, right? It's looking at the data we have and being able to make inferences based on trends and profiles to help accelerate some of those decisions based on either other decisions that you've made in the past or other similarities that it can detect. And so in terms of, how to get started or understanding where we can initially start to leverage some of these capabilities, one of the areas that we look at from a product or solution perspective is help give better context and streamline that process. So, if we kind of break down this whole vulnerability management, now exposure management, A to Z process, it's collect the data, go through and prioritize, assign it out based on how you've prioritized it, and then act on it, right? And those are more or less kind of the four main steps that we're working through. And to take those into smaller bite-sized chunks, AI can help with each and every one of those steps. It's not a replacement from A to Z, but it can help accelerate. It can help provide more details at each of those steps along the way. And then going back to providing more transparency, having comfort levels on what confidence level you're opting into as a consumer. Those are important decision-making processes that happen as well. So early on, right, around data and collecting information and context, well, AI is great at filling in some of that missing data, right? If we're all on the same page that we're never going to get to that perfect data state, well, I can make a big step forward though. I can go from maybe 60 or 70%, CMDB build out and context defined to maybe 85, 90%. And I can do that by leveraging, AI capabilities to say, these are the assets we know about. This is what I'm confident in, that, data is coming from a true source of truth. And then looking at profiles and trends, I can go detect, here's another 100 servers that match this profile. So with 90% confidence, I'm suggesting that these are also crown jewel assets, or maybe these are currently unlisted by remediation owner, so that would typically slow down the MTTR process by not having it assigned. We can make inferences based on the types of assets that they are and who they should be owned by, and so we can accelerate that first step in the process, right? And in each step kind of gets its own special treatment in that way as well, but we're not replacing the ultimate decision making of the end user, and we're certainly not in any way getting rid of the accountability. So at the end of the day, it's leveraging the decisions we've already made, using the context we already have, and accelerating that process further. But it's all based on the processes that the individuals, the end users, have already built out and defined, just helping keep up with that scale.
I think that I love your focus on process and decision making when you were listing out the steps of how you do this. Those in the audience may know, like my mind immediately went to John Boyd and the OODA loop, right? The famous OODA loop so it's you observe, you orient yourself, you decide, and you act, and you keep doing that, right? And what is interesting is that from a program perspective, you end up with it's important that the observation is separate than the orientation and the decision, right? Because you may have multiple, like to go back to a complex environment, you will end up with multiple sources of data that you have to sort out, but you're not looking to make the decision on that data at the point of capture. Like you're trying to look at that in the broader context, and I love how you framed that. You need the process around it to have to apply AI with accountability to accelerate that. And if I have one thing to say, is that I'm sad a little bit that when you brought up the example of the bringing the CMDB from 65 to 85, 90%, and that's considered a success. We as an industry have to work better. Like we have to bring that number up significantly. But again, that comes at a cost and a complexity, right? The challenge is, how do you as an organization build your security program so that you can live with that 90% success rate, but you know how to deal, but you have mitigating controls and processes to handle whatever badness comes from the remainder 10% or whatnot.
Yep.
Right. What would you say, like, I mean, as you're advising people, how do you help? What's been important for them in the context of taking these decisions, this program that you so well defined, in talking to others, like collaborating with others? You brought up the difference between the finding the issues, prioritizing them, and the remediation. Being a little more forward-looking, where do you see this collaboration between teams going?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great future perspective on how to use the tools and capabilities we all have access to now. From a Brinca perspective, even prior to some of the AI conversation, that's really our core focus, right? Is to centralize context, bring all the information together. So if we remove that siloed barrier, if we get rid of individual decision making and individual context points, we now at least all have the same information. It's shared context now.
Okay.
And that's where I think we get to the predictive context side of things. If all the information is there, then we can go set up rules, right? We've always kind of been able to do that with basic conditions and just kind of thinking through if A and B, then C. But there's a certain scale that you kind of hit your head against when you're doing it more manually or as individuals. And I think that's where, going forward, data is everything. The more information we can get, the better decisions that we can have on the output. And from an AI perspective, that's really what, autonomous agents, or however we want to think about it, that's really what they're accomplishing. They're setting up and they're doing the things that we've already made decisions against. They're just detecting the patterns that we've created, the policies that we've constructed, and helping do it at a much broader scale. And they can handle more input. They can handle more, information, more context. And so now I think more than ever, it's crucial to have these teams work together to apply their shared context, right? Teams that have information on who owns what, bring that information in. Other teams have more of the business context side. They know what's deployed in a production environment, or what has access to servers that are processing personal information, or databases that have sensitive information. All of those worlds need to come together, and then also apply in as much information that we can get from what we're collecting from threat intel sources, right? What's actively exploited, or what has proof of concepts. And then tying all of that information together is really kind of the melting pot of where this now becomes advantageous when teams are collaborating and sharing all of this information together, that's when everyone kind of benefits at this scale.
Yeah, I find that this kind of collaboration is a combination of, okay, do we have we reached a level of understanding of our environment, of understanding the business flows within our environment, and then the empathy and the group work of reaching out to others and say, okay, this is how I'm doing this right now. It's interesting because in this age of AI, right, one of the things that I say it's a missed opportunity for this industry is that this is a phenomenal time. This should be the golden age of business process engineering, right? We should all be thinking about our businesses in the abstract a little bit. How do you do this? How do you do that? And where do agents fit? Guess what? That same conversation about how do we do this? How do we do that? That's exactly the kind of what you're describing in terms of bringing that information to the next group, to the other one, to collaborate. I mean, how do we do this?
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting there, but it's
well, and I think that's the transparency side of AI too, right? If we have all the context, if we've brought it all together, and then at the end of the day, like AI is helping accelerate the confidence that we have. We only really can trust in that process if there's transparency as well. So if it can point back and say I've helped infer certain prioritization based on these 2 data points from what would typically just be the IT ops team, and then I also have context that's helping prioritize it further based on the business context that's been provided from another team. That level of transparency is what helps all teams involved understand and not have to go back and rethink through and reprioritize based on their own siloed context. It's all shared, it's all transparent. That's what helps gain trust in that accelerated process.
Perfect. As we're coming up on close here, we'll open it up. Give it a second or two if there's any questions. I have a couple I can follow up on, but I'll give it a minute to see if people want to ask any questions. As we wrap up, like when I have AI conversations with people, one of the challenges has been people struggle with when AI hallucinates. I don't like the term hallucination, but it is a scenario where the AI generated something that doesn't match reality in some way, shape, or form. When you've been talking to people about your application, and I love your point on transparency, how have you handled the hallucination risk that people refer to?
Yeah, well, I think it hones in on a couple points that we've already spent some time talking through, which is really you have to have transparency, and then you need gates. You need different confidence thresholds. Something that is high confidence, you can probably automate a little bit more, right? If it's like a 95% resulting confidence in the decision that's being made or the suggested action that's being recommended, those are things you can automate with a little bit higher trust. But as you get further down that process, you still may want to leverage that information, but it's less fully automated, right? So it's more trust but verify, and human comes in to do a quick review and then pass it forward based on that context. And so again, I think that's where avoid black box, right? You need to be able to understand what is being suggested with what confidence profile and what evidence that's based on, and use that combination of criteria to build in different gates based on the different confidence levels that you've defined.
I think of Kaizen, like continuous improvements, right? We keep now as we are wrapping up here. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about where we've been. We talked about the current problems. We talked about AI, and I'm going to break the chain here, and I'm going to break the streak and say that nobody has brought up mythos. So I'll mention the word mythos. Yes, it's something that we need to look at. That we could do another hour on that alone. So let's not do that right now. Let me just ask you, from a practical perspective, like where do you get people moving first? Like what's the practical takeaway from the conversations that, okay, this is interesting. Where do we go next?
Yeah, I think in turn, like what that accelerator is, what kicks people into that next gear, is that more of what you're asking there?
Kind of. I think that I was going to say from a practical perspective, right? They've heard us talk. They agree with us on the need for process. They agree with us on the need for transparency. Where do you suggest they get started? Or like what's next?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think the easiest points are not fully replacing anything, but looking for net positives or improvements to your process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the approach that we've taken is kind of start on the far left of that 4-step process. If we have that data integration and it's around collecting information, let's add some AI abilities to help infer some of those gaps, to help fill in some of that missing data. That's a pretty low risk opportunity to leverage some of that acceleration, right? It's not ultimately impacting final decisions. We're not going right to any sort of automated decision making, but it's very easy to get in and at least start to fill in the gaps, clean up the data a little bit. In terms of from there, it's just constantly moving forward, and you take it one chunk at a time, right? And then you kind of end up with a fully optimized workflow or pipeline, and it'll always be improved. It'll always be iterated on. But I don't think you'll ever do it in one full swath. I think you have to piece it out and approach it individual, case by case scenario.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I would add that the first thing you do is you agree on the process, about the process, right? Um, and I'm checking here. There's a couple of questions coming in. We'll get to those in a second, but I think that the very practical thing about this is to, as you as a security practitioner, it's about you taking a step back and looking at what does your process look like right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? Make sure that process can handle the uncertainty and the non-perfection of the non-perfect inventories and whatnot, and then reach across the aisle, if you will, and with others. A couple of questions came in. I think we have a few minutes. I'll go by ask the first one. I don't see who the participant is, but they asked, is AI addressing the vulnerabilities from the AI as the way to go? I'll answer with my comment briefly. Is that I think that James covered this beautifully, and I think we've mentioned this a little bit. It's not that AI is addressing the vulnerabilities from AI, but in a supporting role, right? It's more about how do you, to your point, how do you maintain accountability, right? You maintain human accountability. You want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I think the breakdown is AI is not really addressing the vulnerabilities. The process is addressing the vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities discovered from traditional scanners versus what we're seeing now with Mythos, they're not any different. They might have different context or more context around how some of those exploits were detected, and that's great information to have to help prioritize. But you're still leveraging your defined process to address risk that's being identified and exposed. And so I think there's certainly tools that can be used to help accelerate, as we've talked about here today.
Yep.
But it's the same, it's the same potential exposures that we've always talked about. There's nothing different from vulnerabilities that are coming from AI tools other than the volume. It's just the volume problem is now so much harder to address because how quickly they're being detected.
Yeah, I think that there's a volume problem and there is a speed problem, right? On one hand, you have more to triage. On the other, you need you need to triage more, and B, you need to triage more faster, right? Because the expectation is that adversaries will have more access to that quicker. And again, we're not going to turn this into a mythos conversation, but it is one of the consequences of that. It's not. I'm not saying that every adversary is going to move faster because hey, not everybody has access to something like those kinds of the capabilities from mythos, but it tells us where we're going, where the industry is going a little bit, and that's and that's a concern. I'm just mindful of the time. Do we? I'll just wrap up with one more question. You asked. You talked about talking to others. I talked about talking to others. Any advice on how we can handle the nuance on those topics, particularly to non-security stakeholders? Like when you are, and again the mythos comment. To me, what is surprising or what is interesting about mythos is that it's a perfect storm. It's a perfect storm because they named it perfectly, like the mythos. It implies mystery, right? It is about AI, which is an area that not many people are familiar with, and it is about cybersecurity, which is another area that people are not as familiar with. So, what advice would you have to handling non-security stakeholders?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most exciting opportunities that we're seeing and exploring directly is that translation, right? I think from a security engineer perspective, from an IT engineer perspective, we all handle the raw data, the numbers. That's kind of just how our brains work and how we think about and talk about through these processes. But
yeah.
when we start to report to executives or we show reports to other departments within the organization that maybe aren't as security oriented or as technical in terms of depth, it becomes really hard to convey what you're trying to say. That could be anything from the metrics showing the progress you've made or the actions that your team has done to protect the organization, all the way down to validating or justifying the prioritization decisions that you've made. Why did you choose this population of vulnerabilities to address over this one? And so I think that is kind of AI's superpower in some way, is it can look at very large volumes of data and it can help translate it into a lot of different type of conversational points. And so given all the context, we can wrap that up in a nice little summarization, either based on tickets or remediation strategies that are being proposed, and make sure that information is able to be communicated directly with other non-security related experts.
Okay. And on the topic of wrapping up, I think we're going to be wrapping up here. Give folks a couple of minutes back on their day to move on to their next thing. I absolutely adore this conversation. Thank you so much for the focus on for the direction on and the focus on process and this collaboration. I think it's essential and a very, if I may say so, a very sane and or a very measured application of AI throughout the process, right? So I think that thank you very much for that. Any final words before we wrap up?
No, just appreciate the conversation as well. I think it's a very exciting topic. I know everyone's excited to see where the future is going to take us, what opportunities are there. But yeah, I'd say the final thoughts from my side are just lean in, do research, understand what capabilities are there, but make sure that you understand where that accountability comes from as well, because it usually is still back on the exact same individuals. So you gotta make sure that you're leveraging these new abilities responsibly.
Yeah, and 100%. And on the topic of research, I'll just wrap up by saying that the paper we worked on together should be available soon, and so reach out to us. You can find me on social on the socials, as they say. So by all means, reach out if you have questions, and James as well, and the rest of the team. So Mike, you want to bring us home?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, guys, thanks for sharing those insights. I think what I got out of this is that it's essentially a communication issue as much as anything else. It's sometimes we have a failure to communicate because, well, I think part of the issue, frankly, is the people who are creating the fixes for these vulnerabilities only have a limited amount of time, and left to their own devices, they'll probably fix the things that are easy, because fixing the hard things requires more time than they often have. And part of their issue is also that sometimes they don't have control over the thing. If it's a issue related to open source software involving some sort of maintainer somewhere, they more probably won't go after that as readily as some other issue, but they need a way to communicate that back to the security folks, who otherwise will pull their hair out, because, well, they'll be sitting around saying, how come no one's fixing this critical vulnerability? So hopefully we can all come together and find some way to have this conversation, but I think it starts with the data, and that's what you guys are on about. So, hey, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and for you sharing your insights and your questions. I want to thank our speakers for doing much of the same. And to Fernando's point, we'll give you back some of your time for the day, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.